Hi, everybody. Welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about white privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. Here are your discussion questions for this week's assignment, also located in the assignment under the lecture and discussions. So this article was written by Peggy McIntosh back in 1988, and at some point she comes to the realization where she starts to realize that there's a whole series of privileges, specifically with her, the white privileges she has encountered. And she does this because she's listening to and reading articles from women of color. And she says that there's a whole series of unconscious oppressions that start to emerge. And the way that Peggy McIntosh puts it is that white privilege is the advantage received by being born white in a society that favors whiteness, regardless of your wealth, your social class, your awareness, and any awareness of that advantage, right? But more than that, it's the lack of awareness that's key to maintaining that privilege. In other words, whites in general are taught to see themselves as, essentially normal, as morally decent people, as morally neutral, as typical or average, or as the ideal type. And that they are the ones working to benefit others, right? As Peggy puts it, well, I'm a nice person, and we are nice people, and we're helpful, right? Um, and so we're taught to see racism only as individual acts of meanness or violence. And what we're not taught is to see the embedded forms of racism that are invisible. And it's the invisible system that is really conferring the power onto different groups of people, including, but not limited to, white people. So all of the different dominant groups. We're all engaged in some of those dominant groups, even if we are not white or male. So let's first talk about systemic racism, the system, the status quo. Like it's the social structure and how it currently is, right? Is the status quo to the social structure, or what we would call the system, right? So when people are talking about maintaining systemic racism, they're talking about maintaining the status quo of how the social hierarchy currently exists. And if you've never thought about that, if you've never had to think about it, it's probably because you benefit from a whole host of different types of privileges. And what being able to believe in racism as solely the acts of violence or meanness, it allows us as individuals to benefit from systemic inequality, benefit from the built in systems of racism without having to ask ourselves or take on any moral or personal responsibility for how we're benefiting from those how we're benefiting individually from those overarching legal, political, systemic inequalities that exist in society. And Peggy, one of the ways that she comes to this realization is she's asking herself and looking at sexism within society. And so she uses men's understanding of sexism, or men's understanding of sexism and inequality and their own privilege, and then starts to apply that understanding to herself when it comes to white privilege. And she says that men are unwilling to grant that they are overprivileged. Even if men are willing to say that women are disadvantaged, men will not inherently be able to see how they are being advantaged, right? So after she realizes the extent to which men are operating from this type of unacknowledged privilege, she starts to see and understand how they're acting out oppression unconsciously. And she then is able to apply that to herself and realize it is possible and likely and true that she is in that same camp, that we are all essentially in that same camp based on one of our forms of privilege that we have. Um, and what happens here is that because we're not taught to see our privilege, right? And because we're not taught to see embedded systemic oppressions, it's the denial of privilege, is that inherent lack of being able to see it that maintains the inequality within our society, right? So denial of privilege inherently maintains inequality and our systemic racism. Um, if you've never kind of in intro to social, we talk about social structures and systems and stuff, and so you probably remember from them. But systemic racism is essentially how laws, policies, oppression, and suppression based on race is enacted into the system itself. And so we don't need to have individual acts of violence or anger or oppression on a daily basis, because the oppression, the inequality is built within the structure, it's built into the structure of our society. And so due to that, we're inherently benefiting or being disadvantaged from those systemic inequalities that are built into our society. So when we talk about white privilege, what we're talking about is that invisible system that benefits not only our social structure, our status quo, it maintains the status quo, but it also allows for us to not be uncomfortable while we benefit from our privileged position. McIntosh says the white person, I realized, had been taught to see racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of those corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. And white privilege is inherently the unacknowledged privilege, right? And that unacknowledged privilege allows us to maintain comfort. Um, as being part of a dominant group, any dominant group, we're very carefully taught that we shouldn't, or we're taught not to recognize our privileges. And by doing that, we can feel as though we're morally superior. We can feel like we're morally decent people, like we're not benefiting from an unfair advantage. Also, we don't have to then acknowledge or see that someone else does not have the same path or may have more obstacles than we do. And the reason why I say all of us, right? Because clearly not everybody is a white person. There are many millions of people in the world who are people of color. But race isn't the only form of oppression, and we're all living in this society. And so we're all kind of socialized into this, right? And so for some people, they don't have to experience different forms of systemic inequality, but they do experience some other forms of privilege where they are in, just happen to be in a dominant group. Intersectionality is the intersections, right, of those different forms of dominant and subordinate groups. So it's all of those hierarchies in our society that are interlocking. Some of them deny us privilege and protect the hierarchy, and some of them give us access to resources that are inherently a privilege because they're denied to someone else. And so race and sex aren't the only advantaging systems at work, according to Peggy McIntosh, right? And she's kind of connecting her theory here to intersectionality, and she talks about how socioeconomic status, age, ethnicity, sexuality, physical ability, religion, nationality, all those things can also be um, part of the story in which you are encompassed, right? And so, yes, you might benefit from white privilege, but you might have a physical disability. You might, everybody will eventually age for the most part if you don't unfortunately pass away, or you might not be part of the dominant sexuality. You might be part of the LGBTQ community, or you might not be privileged in terms of class, right? So it is that system of hierarchies that is connected, and they cross over and create a different spectrum of privilege and of oppression for each and every individual within our society. And the reason why we are able to see some of them but not others is partially the story of the invisible knapsack we'll talk about in a minute, but it's also because these interlocking oppressions have both what she calls active and embedded forms of oppression. There's two types of oppression, right? So there's active oppression, which is, that is what we think of. That is overt racism. That's anger and hostility. It's violence, right? It's maybe overt sexism, hostility and violence towards women. Those are active forms of oppression. Embedded is very invisible, and the dominant group's actually not taught to see it at all. It's those laws, those policies, those everyday embedded cultural norms and values that disadvantage a group based on their race or their class or their ethnicity or their physical ability or their religion, right? And so what happens is, if you are part of that privileged group, you can legitimately feel like you can say, hey, I'm not racist because I do not act mean to individual people based on race. Because I don't do that, I'm inherently a good person. I'm a moral person. I'm a decent human being. I'm helpful, right? You are allowed to deny the systemic racism because it's invisible to you, the systemic oppression in other regards because it's invisible to you, right? And therefore, your silence and your denial doesn't even cause you any moral injury because you can't see it. Part of that is our educational line in which we're taking. The more educated a population is, the more likely they are to see macro level social structures. The less educated you are, the less likely you can even see those social structures on the macro level, and how those macro level social structures play a role in actually impacting your life. It becomes invisible to you. But also, even if you are educated, when you hold a place of privilege, there's a whole set of cultural norms and values and systems that allow us to continue to be blind to those systemic inequalities that we see. So I bring up Aesop's fables because, a lot of times we look at things in like isolation, right? All of academia, all intellectual thought is built on other intellectual thought. Peggy herself says, I'm reading the literature of Black women, and I'm seeing, because of that, my own white privilege, and it's making me question white privilege. And then I'm seeing, sexism, male privilege, and it's highlighting for me my own forms of privilege. Well, for me, as soon as I read this like 20 years ago, back when I was in grad school. And as soon as I read her story, I was like, oh, it's an Aesop's fable. And we know Aesop's fable, at least my generation did. I'm Generation X, right? I'm almost 50. I'm 48 right now. I don't mind sharing my age. And so in our time, we would have the cartoons, right? So the tortoise and the hare, um, the fox and the grapes. Like we knew these stories, and these stories are really, really old. They go back. The written stories go back to Aesop. It's one of the very first books, and it's a whole series of really short stories told to little kids, and these stories highlight like kind of moral values that they're trying to teach us, right? Like the tortoise and the hare, right? And so I immediately knew this was an Aesop's fable, and I thought it was really interesting because she would have known too. Like she knew the story clearly, and so she's pulling this very old story into the modern era and using it, a little kid story. It's a fable. I mean, it's really cool, and she's using it to kind of explain and expand upon something like white privilege, right? So the story is um, Aesop's fable. Here's the quote: "The two bags." That's the story. This is the whole story. "Every man carries two bags about him, one in front and one behind, and both are full of faults. The bag in front contains his neighbor's faults, and the bag behind his own. Hence, it is that men do not see their own faults, but never fail to see those of others," right? And so that's what this story is, right? The invisible knapsack is a reference to that, right? She says, "White privilege is like invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks that you can use to gain access to resources. You don't even realize you have that invisible knapsack with you, right? But you know what you do see? You see the bag that's in front of you, and that's the one that has your neighbor's privilege, the coworker's privilege, right? You always see when you're disadvantaged. What you never see is what's behind you, which is the privileges that you have, right? So to the extent, so she makes, an argument then, right? Like she says, the extent to which men work from a base of unacknowledged privilege was understood to be unconscious, right? She knows it's unconscious. She argues white privilege is also unconscious, and for very good reason. It keeps us feeling morally just, like it's okay, like I haven't done anything wrong, like I'm not gaining an unfair advantage. Um, if you're not aware of your own participation in the oppression of others, here's the question for you. Are you still responsible for the oppression of others, right? And I've heard people say like, well, not talking about this in particular, but other things. Well, if I don't do it on purpose, then I don't feel guilty because it's not really my fault, right? But then the question would be, are you still responsible even if you didn't mean to do it? What if it was out of carelessness, right? Or what if it was just because you've never had to even think that through, right? So if you're not aware of your participation in the oppression of others, are you still responsible? And what she points out is that whites in general are taught to think of themselves as kind of normal or average, as morally neutral, and it allows you as a person to feel like you're maybe the ideal type, right? And it allows you to participate in bias unconsciously, right? And because it's unconscious in that regard, that over time and completed by millions and millions of people, that unconscious bias accumulates and creates a society where it maintains the status quo of our current structure. And what is our current social structure? What's our current status quo? Well, we're built on, foundationally, America is built on, we've learned this through racial formation, remember, right? We're built on inequality and racism. So our society, much like a people mover in an airport, once it starts going in one direction, it's going to continue going in that direction, right? And if you get on that people mover and you just stand there, you are participating in that unconscious implicit bias, but you feel like you're not doing anything to help it. And so therefore, even though you're still benefiting from all of those privileges of that privilege of it going in that direction, but you can still feel morally just and righteous and not have any guilt, right? So that's why we say, like, we don't necessarily have to have white guilt to, and you could still have white privilege, right? But what happens if you were to turn around, like say on an escalator, right? You benefit from an escalator if you just stand there. But if you actually try to fight against racism, what you're doing is you're essentially turning around and going against the grain. You're trying to go back down that escalator that's pulling you up. One, it becomes a lot harder. Two, it becomes really, really, really obvious that you're being pulled in the opposite direction that you're trying to go. And three, everybody around you is going to get mad at you and be angry with you, right? And see you as the problem, when inherently it's the system that's moving in that direction that is the problem, right? This unconscious bias, this invisible knapsack of privilege, this is what maintains the status quo. This is what maintains our current social structure. And what you probably feel if you don't have a physical disability, if you are not religiously oppressed, if you're not oppressed based on your sexuality, if you're not oppressed based on your sex or your race, is you feel like what you're doing is natural and normal, right? You feel like what the other person is doing is wrong or somehow their fault, right? So they're the person going the opposite way on the escalator because they're fighting it. And that's why you might see somebody say, well, if a black person gets arrested, they were the ones doing something wrong. They must have deserved it because clearly no matter what I do, maybe, for example, I also have drugs in my vehicle, but I've never been arrested because I'm not really doing anything wrong, right? But they got arrested for having drugs in their vehicle. Clearly, they were the ones doing something wrong because they got arrested. People will make the assumption, I've heard people say, well, black people are more likely to get arrested for drugs. And it must be because they're just more likely to have drugs in their vehicle. The FBI has actually done research. There's data. There's a ton of data on this. And we know based on the FBI data that it has nothing to do with the color of your skin, how likely you are to have drugs in your vehicle. So based on the FBI data, whether you're white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whoever you are, the chances are that any individual person will have drugs or alcohol in their vehicle at any given time is about the same. There's not really a difference based on race. What changes though is if you're black, you're more likely to get pulled over and searched and therefore arrested for having drugs in your vehicle. So that's the systemic inequality that's invisible. Because it's invisible, Peggy talks about something called the white savior. And so a white savior is the idea that a socially privileged person, any individual who's socially privileged, simply by virtue of their position, their privileged position, that they have some kind of unique ability or power to help less privileged people. in ways that those people somehow are not able to help themselves, right? So the idea that, if they live the way I live my life, right, I can teach them something. I can teach them how to behave appropriately because the way that I live my life has led me to this privilege, right? It's based on merit. So there again is the invisible knapsack. I have reached my goals because of my moral superiority, because of my stronger work ethic, because I know the right way to do things, right? And therefore, I'm in a position where I can teach them to be more like us, right? And never the other way around, right? So people who go on missions, for example, they don't go to learn from those other cultures. They go to impose their values on those other cultures. And that's where that idea of the white savior comes from, because for many people of color, they find this to be offensive. And they find this to be offensive because that person really doesn't understand where the people of color or the underprivileged people are coming from and the obstacles that they really face, right? And it's them going there to feel better about themselves. It has more to do with that from the less privileged community's perspective than it is about them being able to help those communities. A good, so the reason why we do this is because we have this idea of the other, right? And if we hold a position of privilege, we believe that the other is the one that should kind of move towards our own position, right? That because we're the ones that, if we perceive ourselves to be the normal, the typical, the morally just, right? It should be them moving towards the way we think and not us moving towards the way they think or act. And a comparison is the kind of the current upset, right? And we've seen it, I think, a little bit in social media, where cisgendered men are getting really, really upset about being labeled cisgendered. And you should remember the definition, right? So it simply means to be a male-bodied person who has the gendered identity of a male, right? And somehow this is upsetting to cisgendered men, and it's because they see themselves as the one that is natural and innate and average and typical, and everybody else as the deviation from them. So they don't believe they need a label. It's only other people that need to be labeled, and that's why it's distressing from that perspective for them. Okay, so let me ask you a few questions because we're talking a lot about, white privilege and male privilege, but again, I want to reiterate that, privilege is not solely about race or sex. It also has to do with a lot of other forms of our identities, right? Our sexuality, our religion, our nationality, all of these things. And so I want to ask you, can you identify your own privileges? You have privileges, I guarantee it. When you believe that you are only disadvantaged and you're not privileged, you have no advantages, you're simply missing where you're privileged. And that is, again, because that knapsack is invisible to you. So here's a few questions for you. Can you identify the ways in which you're privileged? Do you see the patterns running through the matrix of domination? Do you see the patterns of assumptions that were passed on to you based on your race or your class or your sexuality? Is your group confident, comfortable, oblivious to other groups? How does your dominant group status protect you from hostility, distress, and violence? How are you, or were you, unconsciously trained to turn on subordinate groups? Can you distinguish between earned strength and unearned power by conferred privilege? Can you identify permissions given to escape or to dominate? Can you differentiate between permissions to escape or dominate and strength over people? Are you willing to become aware of it in society? And I think that's the biggest one. Are you are you open to becoming aware of your own privileges? Are you willing to acknowledge your privileges? Have a wonderful day. And yeah, that's it. Bye, guys.